Hey guys, tonight we're stepping inside the stone walls of a medieval castle, a world of flickering torchlight, towering stone walls, and secrets whispered in the shadows. The air smells of damp stone and burning wood, and the grand halls are filled with hushed conversations about politics, power, and prestige. But behind the grandeur, there's a hidden layer of rules that governed every movement, every glance, every word of the nobles who lived there. You probably won't survive this if you don't know the right seat to take at the dinner table, or if you mess up your etiquette at the most critical moments. So let's dive into the unspoken codes that could make or break a noble's reputation. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Post your location and local time. I love seeing where you're all tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The intricate etiquette of the castle dining table. Imagine yourself in a grand, candlelit hall. You've just entered a medieval castle, a place where stone walls have witnessed centuries of power struggles, where history is etched into every corner, but where the most mundane moments often held the greatest significance. As you enter the castle's dining hall, it's not the towering battlements or intricate tapestries that catch your attention, but the dinner table, the long oak table with stretches from one end of the hall to the other. It's not just a place to eat, it's a place to be seen, a place to affirm your rank and your relationships, a place to make decisions that ripple through the future. It was here that noble families gathered, shared meals, and engaged in conversations that might shape the course of nations. Though most of those conversations would seem trivial to us today. It was here that rules, hidden in plain sight, dictated how one should behave. The first thing you'll notice is the order. The seating arrangements were meticulous, but they weren't just a matter of preference. They were dictated by status. The highest ranking guest, usually the lord of the castle, sat at the center of the table. Beside him, his closest allies or family members, each positioned according to their rank, wealth, and power. The farthest seats were reserved for lower-ranking guests, often those who had less power but more to gain from association with the highborn. Each of these positions carried an unwritten rule. A nobleman who dared sit in the wrong seat could face humiliation, or worse, a subtle but powerful reprimand that might damage his social standing. But the rules were not only about seating, they extended to every aspect of the meal. The table itself, carved from the finest wood available, was often set with a dozen or more heavy plates, bowls, and goblets. The food simple by today's standards, but a luxury at the time, was served in abundance. But only those with the highest rank could reach for the finest cuts of meat. The rest were left with bread, gruel, or root vegetables, reflecting the deep social divide that the meal served to reinforce. The etiquette was complex. A noble could not simply reach for food as they wished. Each meal was a subtle dance of gestures and timing. For example, you must wait until the Lord has begun eating before you can take your first bite. This rule was more than mere politeness. It was an assertion of authority, a sign that the Lord, at the head of the table, controlled the flow of the evening. While the Lord and his family enjoyed the main course, the lower-ranking guests, including the castle staff, would eat later, often at a separate table or in the kitchens. Though this may seem harsh by modern standards, it was a fact of life in the medieval world. The separation of the nobility from the commoners was not just a matter of convenience, it was a clear social distinction. But here's the most fascinating part. Despite all these rules, the dining table was not just a place to reinforce hierarchy, it was also a space for subtle power plays. In the midst of the meal, you could find alliances being formed or quietly broken, deals being struck over the course of a meal, and rivalries simmering just beneath the surface of polite conversation. One of the most important rules of the table was never to speak directly of business, especially political business. The dinner table was a place to appear civil and cordial, even if a battle for land or title was being waged in the halls behind closed doors. The art of conversation was paramount. A skilled noble could win over an ally or diminish an opponent simply through words without a single blade being drawn. So, as you sit at the table, you might wonder, how could something as mundane as a meal hold so much power over the lives of those present? What was it about the social rituals of the medieval dinner table that made it such a key battleground for the politics of the time? Perhaps it's the very nature of these subtle interactions that makes them so significant. The rules, as hidden as they may seem, were the building blocks of the castle's social structure, and, perhaps, beneath the power dynamics and carefully controlled conversations, there were moments where even the smallest gesture could change the course of history. As the evening deepens, the candlelight flickers, casting shadows on the walls of the grand hall. You sit back, your mind racing through the rules you've already encountered, and wonder what more lies beneath the surface of these seemingly ordinary interactions. There's more to the medieval dining table than its rigid hierarchy and meticulous etiquette. The castle's dining rituals went far beyond the art of conversation and the seating arrangements. There was an unspoken language at play, one that not only reflected the rigid social structure, but also created subtle power dynamics that could shift the course of history. As the meal progresses, you notice the positioning of the servants. They are always present, but always on the periphery, almost invisible to the guests at the table. They carry the platters of food, fill goblets with wine, and fetch more bread or meat as needed. But they do not sit. They do not partake in the feast. Their role is one of silent servitude, and their actions are governed by invisible rules too. A servant's eyes rarely meet those of the nobility, for even such a glance might be seen as a breach of protocol, a challenge to the invisible hierarchy that governed every aspect of the meal. Yet, despite this invisibility, the servants held their own kind of power. They were the keepers of secrets, the ones who heard everything and saw everything. As a noble might be careful about what they said in the presence of other nobles, they were even more cautious around the servants. These quiet figures could turn the tide of power through a whispered word or a slight change in their demeanor. A servant who had long been in the household might know more about the Lord's secret dealings than any of the guests at the table. Consider the importance of the steward of the household. This figure, often overlooked, was far more than just a manager of food and drink. The steward was a trusted confidant of the Lord and often wielded more influence than many of the knights or courtiers who sat at the table. He knew what was going on in the Lord's lands, who was aligned with whom, and often what deals were being made behind closed doors. His role at the table was a silent one, yet his control over the distribution of food, who ate what, when, and how much gave him a peculiar kind of power. What's even more interesting is the role that food itself played in these subtle exchanges. Certain foods were seen as symbols of status, and by what one ate or refused to eat, an individual could make a statement. For instance, the Lord might choose to eat a specific cut of meat, such as venison or boar, symbolizing both his wealth and his hunting prowess. But the significance didn't end there. Even the manner in which food was consumed carried meaning. A noble might avoid reaching for the common bread too eagerly, for doing so could suggest a lack of refinement. It was the careful handling of these minute gestures that could signal one's social acumen or lack thereof. In this way, the dining table was a microcosm of the broader medieval world, where every action, no matter how small, carried weight. A misplaced gesture, a poorly timed comment, or even a wrong choice in food could be the difference between favor and downfall. A noble's standing was constantly at risk, and the dinner table was a reflection of that precariousness. But there was more to this dance than just the serving of food. As the night went on, you might notice the way certain guests interact with each other, especially those of similar rank. They speak in low voices, sharing secrets or discussing matters that, on the surface, seem trivial. However, these conversations are not as innocent as they might appear. Small whispers could convey much more than gossip. They were the foundation of alliances and rivalries. Imagine, for instance, two barons quietly discussing their lands during the meal. To the untrained ear, it's simply casual chatter. But for those who understand the subtleties of the medieval world, these conversations were loaded with meaning. Who controlled which piece of land? Who was struggling with debt? Or who had a daughter available for marriage? Were all topics disguised in polite words. The dinner table, thus, became a place where silent negotiations and veiled threats were made under the guise of politeness. Then, there was the matter of drink. Wine was not just a beverage, it was a social tool. The amount and type of wine one consumed during the meal said much about their standing. A lord would often have his wine poured by a trusted servant, ensuring that no one could accuse him of overindulgence. But even more interesting was the use of wine as a weapon in subtle power struggles. Imagine a rival noble seeking to undermine the host's authority, subtly influencing the amount of wine poured into his goblet, perhaps just enough to induce a sense of dizziness or unwelcome looseness in the conversation. These small manipulations might be overlooked in the moment, but they could have long-lasting effects on the relationships between the nobles. So, as you sit at the table, surrounded by the grand hall's shadows and flickering light, you begin to understand this is not just a meal, it's a complex web of power, hidden in the most ordinary actions, playing out in the most mundane of settings. The castle's dining hall is more than just a place for sustenance. It's a place where the threads of history are woven, where decisions are made with a casual word, a slight gesture, and the choice of one's seat. But how much influence did these dinner table power dynamics truly hold? Could a single evening's conversation shape the course of an entire kingdom? And in a time when honor was often linked to a meal, could a poorly managed dinner turn the tide of a battle or a noble's life? The night is now growing late, the sounds of the meal fading into the quiet murmurs of after-dinner conversation. The flickering candles cast long shadows across the faces of the gathered guests, whose postures and expressions betray a sense of fatigue. Yet there is an underlying tension in the air. This is the moment where the weight of the meal, the seating arrangement, the conversations, and the subtle gestures come to fruition. It's not merely about food, it's about power. This power plays out in the most unlikely of places, and it is often the unseen consequences of these gatherings that shape history. As the dinner draws to a close, the nobles slowly rise from their seats, stretching their legs after hours of sitting rigidly at attention. The banquet hall, still warm with the heat of the fire and the weight of polite conversations, empties gradually, but for those paying close attention, the true drama is unfolding, not in the last toast or in the final nod of gratitude to the Lord, but in the subtle exchange of glances, the way some figures linger while others quickly exit. The invisible game of power continues long after the plates are cleared. One such subtlety was the impact of the banquet on political alliances. Let's take a look at one example. Imagine two powerful lords, both with vast estates and influential positions in the kingdom. On the surface, they appear to be allies, sitting together at the dinner table, sharing wine and polite conversation. But beneath the surface, the conversation is a battle of its own kind. As the evening wears on, the one lord who has long suspected betrayal from the other watches closely. He notices how his counterpart keeps his gaze just a little too long on a neighboring baron, a man whose lands have recently expanded through what many suspect is shady dealings. He notices how the rival lord seems to subtly nod in agreement with a comment that undermines his own interests. The food might have been consumed, but the real power was still at play now, in the form of gestures, eye contact, and carefully placed comments that suggested discord. Perhaps the host, already feeling the weight of the political situation, makes a subtle move to distance himself from his former ally. The banquet becomes a quiet battlefield of alliances, where no sword is drawn, but where the consequences of words and gestures will linger for years. But the true power of these meals wasn't necessarily in the decisions made during the evening. Rather, it was in the aftermath. After the last of the guests has departed, the host remains behind. Considering the subtle dynamics of the evening, he might reflect on the guest's behavior, who laughed too loudly, who kept glancing nervously at the door, who seemed to take an unusual interest in a certain topic. These small clues would be taken into account, sometimes months after the dinner itself. It was the slow and steady weaving of these social threads that dictated the fate of relationships. For those with a keen eye, such gatherings were opportunities to adjust alliances, to alter the balance of power, and even to lay the groundwork for political maneuvers that would take years to fully unfold. The knight who had been an ally one evening might become an opponent the next. The young noble who had been eager to secure a marriage alliance could find his hopes dashed by a rival's quiet move during dessert. What often went unnoticed was the silent but profound impact these gatherings had on the legacy of the castle itself. The smallest actions taken within its walls, from who spoke first to who was given the best seat, could change the course of a family's fortunes. One poorly timed decision, one wrong word spoken under the guise of politeness, could be enough to fracture an empire, set up a rivalry that would echo for generations, or even ensure the fall of a powerful noble house. But what was the lasting legacy of these invisible power games? Were these subtle dinner table dynamics really as important as we think? Or were they merely a reflection of the broader historical events at play. Perhaps it is a bit of both. The nobility had mastered the art of controlling the unseen forces that shaped their lives. They knew how to navigate these subtleties to their advantage, turning seemingly trivial moments into powerful gestures that would mark the history of their family, their kingdom, and the world. Now, as you think back on the evening, you might wonder, what if the future of the entire realm had been determined by something as simple as where someone sat at the table? What if the fate of a kingdom had been sealed by a few misplaced words or a subtle gesture no one else noticed? Could history truly be shaped by such small, mundane moments? Or is it the perception of power, how it's handled and how it's displayed, that makes all the difference? It's these questions, these nuances of the medieval dining table, that serve as a reminder history is not only made in the grand battles or the royal proclamations, but also in the quiet, hidden corners of daily life, where power is whispered rather than shouted, where alliances are forged in silence, and where the smallest of gestures can echo through the ages. As we reflect on the quiet power of the medieval castle's dining table, we realize that sometimes history isn't just made in great moments of triumph or disaster. Often, it is shaped by the subtle, seemingly insignificant actions that go unnoticed by many, but carry enormous weight for those involved. In our own time, perhaps we too are unknowingly part of such small yet consequential moments. Who knows which of our daily gestures might one day ripple through history? This was the quiet power of the medieval castle. Though these moments may seem boring at first glance, they are the ones that have shaped the present we live in, reminding us that even the most mundane details of life can have profound effects. The forgotten lives of medieval scribes. Imagine the dimly lit corners of a medieval scriptorium. You enter a room filled with the scent of parchment and ink, where the soft scratch of quills against paper is the only sound that breaks the silence. Here, in this small, quiet space, lives a group of people often overlooked by history scribes. These humble individuals, though never celebrated in the grand tales of knights and kings, were the true guardians of knowledge in the medieval world. The scriptorium, a simple room often located in the upper levels of a monastery or castle, was a place where words were carefully transcribed onto parchment by the hands of these scribes. To the modern eye, this task might seem tedious, even dull, but in the Middle Ages, it was nothing short of monumental. Without the scribes, much of the knowledge of the ancient world would have been lost. Without them, the stories of kings, saints, and ordinary people would have faded into oblivion. As you look around, you see scribes hunched over their work, their eyes strained from hours of meticulous copying. Their task was to replicate not just any text, but the great works of literature, philosophy, religion, and science. In a world where books were rare and expensive, each manuscript was a treasure, and it was the scribes who made it possible for these treasures to be passed down through the generations. But it wasn't just the preservation of knowledge that made the scribes' work so important. It was the creation of new texts. Many scribes were also authors in their own right, writing letters, religious tracts, and historical records that would shape the course of history. While their names were rarely recorded, their impact on the medieval world was immense. They were the true architects of the medieval intellectual landscape, quietly laying the foundation for the future of learning. The scribe's work, though necessary, was often invisible to those in the higher ranks of society. Noblemen and kings rarely took the time to thank the scribes, who toiled away in the quiet rooms of monasteries, their hands covered in ink, their eyes fixed on their work. The scribe's existence was one of isolation and routine. They did not participate in the grand feasts, the tournaments, or the political machinations of the time. They were the quiet workers behind the scenes, their only company being the books they copied. But their work was not just about writing down words. The scribes were responsible for the preservation of languages, cultures, and histories that would otherwise have been forgotten. They were the keepers of the past, and it was their diligence and patience that allowed the medieval world to carry the knowledge of antiquity into the future. At first glance, the life of a scribe seems monotonous. Yet, as we delve deeper into their world, we begin to see the complexity of their task. The process of copying a manuscript was an art form in itself. The scribe had to carefully choose his ink, mix it to the right consistency, and apply it to the parchment without smudging or damaging the delicate surface. Every letter had to be perfect, every word carefully spaced, and the text arranged in such a way that it would be easy for others to read. The process was painstaking, and the mistakes were costly, but for all the skill required, the scribe's work went largely unnoticed. Few people beyond the monastery or castle would ever know their names. The rewards were few, yet, without the scribes, the medieval world would not have had access to the writings of Aristotle, Cicero, or Augustine. They were the silent bridge between the ancient and medieval worlds. As the candlelight flickers and the ink dries on a newly copied page, you might wonder, what motivated these men and women to dedicate their lives to this task? What drove them to spend hours, days, and sometimes years writing out manuscripts by hand, with little recognition or reward? What did they think of the importance of their work? Did they know, in some small way, that they were shaping the future? As the days stretch into weeks and months, you begin to understand that the life of a scribe was not only about long hours of work, it was about a deep, unspoken commitment to a craft that would live on long after they had passed. The life of a scribe was one of routine, discipline, and dedication, but it was also one of immense personal sacrifice. The scribe's day began long before the sun had fully risen. In the cold hours of the morning, he would make his way to the scriptorium, sometimes in complete silence, save for the soft echo of his footsteps on the stone floors. The room was always dim, lit only by the flickering flames of oil lamps, which cast shadows over the pages of parchment that lay scattered about. The flickering light made the ink appear alive, shifting in the low glow. The scribe would sit at his desk, often hunched over his work, his eyes straining as he copied text, letter by letter, with painstaking precision. Despite the routine, there were challenges that a scribe faced daily. Parchment, the material they worked with, was not cheap. It was a precious commodity, and each sheet was used with the utmost care. A mistake was a disaster. Imagine carefully copying hundreds of words, only to realize that a letter or a word was wrong, forcing the scribe to either start over or make a correction so delicate that it was almost invisible to the naked eye. The cost of errors was high, not just in terms of the resources used, but also in the time it would take to correct them. In addition to the materials, the scribe had to contend with the physical strain of his work. Hours hunched over his desk, writing with quill and ink, took their toll on the body. The scribe's hand would ache from the constant motion, and his neck and back would become stiff from the bent posture. The work could be exhausting, leaving the scribe with little energy to do much else. Many scribes developed chronic ailments, like repetitive stress injuries to their hands and wrists, or eye problems from the constant reading and writing in dim light. Yet, despite the pain and fatigue, the scribe persevered. His work was too important to abandon. The scribe's life was not just physically demanding, it was also intellectually challenging. To copy a manuscript wasn't simply a matter of writing down words. It required a deep understanding of the text. Some scribes worked on religious texts, like the Bible, while others copied the works of classical philosophers, poets, and historians. They had to be familiar with the language, the nuances of the text, and sometimes even the historical context. A single mistake could alter the meaning of an entire passage. And in a world where written texts were revered as almost sacred, the scribe had to be meticulous and respectful of the text's original meaning. While many of the scribes were monks or members of religious orders, some came from secular backgrounds. Regardless of their origins, they shared a deep sense of duty to preserve knowledge. For the monks, this duty was often framed as a religious calling. They saw themselves as humble servants of God, tasked with ensuring that sacred texts were preserved for future generations. The act of writing was, to them, a form of devotion, a way to serve both God and humanity. However, not all scribes were motivated purely by faith. Many secular scribes, employed by noble families, royalty, or scholars, saw their work as a way to elevate their status or to gain favor with their patrons. In these cases, the role of the scribe became more about survival in a world where education and knowledge were the keys to power. Secular scribes might be tasked with writing letters, legal documents, or historical records, and their work was integral to the functioning of the medieval court or bureaucracy. While their work may not have been viewed as sacred, it was no less important. Though they may have worked in relative isolation, the scribes were by no means entirely cut off from the world around them. They interacted with patrons, fellow scholars, and the occasional noble, but these interactions were often distant and formal. They were not invited to the grand feasts held by the noble families they served. They did not join in the celebrations or the social activities of the court. They were peripheral figures in a world of power, wealth, and luxury. Their lives were far removed from the drama of politics and court intrigue. Instead, they lived in quiet service to the written word. The paradox of the scribe's existence is striking. They were some of the most important people in the medieval world, yet their lives were often humble and unnoticed. Their work was indispensable, but their identities were often lost to history. The names of the great kings, the mighty warriors, and the powerful nobles have been preserved, but how many of us can recall the names of the men and women who preserved those very stories? But perhaps that is what makes their role so significant. The scribes were the hidden architects of history, the ones who ensured that the stories of the past were not lost to time. It is because of them that we know about the lives of people who lived centuries ago. Without the scribes, there would be no history to study, no ancient manuscripts to analyze, and no connection to the civilizations that shaped our world. As the evening wanes and the last flickers of candlelight dim, you find yourself reflecting on the scribe's quiet life. Would it have been enough for them to simply know the importance of their work? Could they see the legacy they were creating, even as they sat alone, transcribing page after page? And perhaps more poignantly, did they ever wonder what would happen to the knowledge they preserved after they were gone? Would anyone remember them, or would they, like the words they wrote, fade into the pages of history, forgotten and uncelebrated? The last pages of the manuscript are written, the ink has dried, the quill rests, and the scribe takes a deep, measured breath. The work is finished, at least for now. The day's labor, filled with long hours and aching muscles, has culminated in this quiet moment of reflection in the silence of the scriptorium, surrounded by the weight of the written word. It's easy to wonder, what will become of this manuscript? What legacy does the scribe leave behind? Though the scribe's name may never be remembered, the impact of their work is profound. As centuries pass, their manuscripts, once hidden away in the dusty libraries of monasteries or castles, will make their way into the hands of kings, scholars, and intellectuals, shaping the world as we know it. These texts, often religious, philosophical, or historical, would influence the course of ideas, spark revolutions of thought, and eventually help give birth to the Renaissance. In the medieval world, however, the scribes could never have foreseen the far-reaching impact of their work. They transcribed not for fame or recognition, but for the preservation of knowledge. In their hands, fragile sheets of parchment became vessels for the ideas of the ancient world, ideas that had been in danger of being lost to time. They copied texts of ancient philosophers like Aristotle and Plato, the works of Roman and Greek historians, and the teachings of early Christian fathers. These texts, once confined to dusty scrolls and obscure libraries, would travel across Europe, influencing future generations of thinkers, scientists, and theologians. But even as their manuscripts began to travel and influence others, the scribes themselves remained largely anonymous. It is unlikely that any of them truly grasped the weight of the legacy they were creating. As they copied their manuscripts day after day, they were focused not on fame, but on the quiet dignity of their work. They were scholars and servants, bound to the laborious task of preserving what could so easily have been forgotten. Their hands, ink-stained and worn, bore the weight of history with quiet grace, even as their identities were obscured by time. And so, the scribes, those humble figures, became an essential bridge between the classical world and the modern age. In their steady hands, the knowledge of the ancients was preserved and passed down to future generations. They laid the foundation for universities, for libraries, for the intellectual movements that would reshape the world. The work they did was not merely transcription, it was the act of cultural survival. Through their efforts, entire civilizations' worth of knowledge was safeguarded. As time marched on, the invention of the printing press in the 15th century changed everything. The handwritten manuscripts that had once been the cornerstone of intellectual life would slowly give way to printed books. The printing press made it easier and faster to reproduce texts, spreading knowledge even further. However, the scribe's legacy remained. The skills, patience, and attention to detail that they embodied laid the groundwork for this new revolution in communication. Without their careful work, the printed books that flooded Europe during the Renaissance would not have been possible. What is perhaps most remarkable about the scribe's legacy is how it continues to shape our world. Even in the digital age, the manuscripts they so carefully copied, with their marginalia and beautifully crafted letters, have been digitized and preserved in libraries across the globe. Scholars still study these texts, tracing the origins of modern ideas back to the minds of the men and women who worked in silence, far from the glittering courts and the pomp of the nobility. Today, we rely on these preserved manuscripts to understand the past, just as those who came after the scribes would rely on their work to understand their own world. As the evening draws to a close, and you sit in the quiet reflection of the scriptorium, you might wonder how many more stories like this remain hidden just beneath the surface of history. How many more unsung heroes, like the scribes, toiled in silence, shaping the world in ways that no one will ever know. Perhaps that is the most profound lesson the scribes left behind, the reminder that even the most unnoticed work can have an immeasurable impact. The scribe's legacy serves as a quiet but powerful reminder. History is not just shaped by the grand figures of power, the kings and generals who take center stage, but also by those who labor in the background, often unnoticed, but whose contributions reverberate through time. Their work may seem ordinary, even boring, to those who look only for grand gestures, but it is often these quiet acts of preservation and attention to detail that have shaped the course of our world. As you think back to the scribe hunched over his work, quill in hand, you might reflect on your own life. How often do we find ourselves engaged in quiet, unnoticed tasks, convinced they will never make a mark on the world? Yet, in the grand sweep of history, it is often these very moments that matter most. The forgotten world of medieval builders. Step into the bustling construction site of a medieval castle, a scene that, on the surface, might seem chaotic, workers shouting orders, hammers ringing, the thud of stone being lowered into place. Yet, when you look closer, you realize that this is not just a physical task. It is a slow, deliberate act of creation that will stand for centuries. The castle, its towering walls, its impressive keep, its intricate battlements is a testament not just to the power of the Lord who commissioned it, but to the hands of the craftsmen who built it. The builders of these medieval fortresses, often seen as anonymous figures in the grand pages of history, were in fact the unsung heroes of the medieval world. They were not the nobles or the soldiers who fought on the battlegrounds, but the quiet laborers who, with skill and patience, shaped the very structures that defined the medieval landscape. Their work was one of precision and artistry, even if the results often went unnoticed by those who passed by the finished product. As you stand on the edge of this construction site, you can see the master builders at work. They move with purpose, directing the laborers who haul the heavy stones and cut them to the proper shape. Every stone put is an act of precision, a mark of the builder's skill. But the builder's work was far more than just a physical craft. It was a deeply intellectual one. These men were engineers, architects, and craftsmen all rolled into one, and their understanding of structure, weight, and balance was unparalleled. The construction of a castle required more than just the right materials. It required an intricate knowledge of design and geometry. The master builder would often be tasked with planning the entire structure, designing the walls, the towers, and the defensive mechanisms, While the lord or the king may have given the initial orders, it was the builder who had to ensure that the structure would stand the test of time. A single miscalculation could result in a collapse, turning an imposing fortress into a pile of rubble. Yet, despite the immense responsibility placed upon their shoulders, the builders were rarely recognized. They were not celebrated in the same way as the nobles or the knights. In fact, their names have often been lost to history. They were seen as mere laborers, the hands behind the stone, but not the minds behind the vision. Their role in the creation of these castles was a quiet, largely invisible one, even though the impact of their work would echo through the centuries. At the time, the builder's craft was not just about creating something functional. The castles were symbols of power and status. A lord who could afford to build a grand castle was signaling to the world that his power was secure. The grandeur of the castle was meant to inspire awe and intimidation, both in the common people and in rival lords. And yet, while the lords and their families may have lived in opulence, it was the builders who had labored tirelessly to bring these grand structures to life. The process of construction was not easy. The builders worked long hours in all kinds of weather, rain, heat, or cold, sometimes for months, sometimes for years. The work was grueling, and the dangers were constant. The lifting of massive stones, the carving of intricate designs, the building of walls that would eventually rise to incredible heights. These tasks were not without risk. Accidents on the construction site were common. Workers fell from great heights, and stones sometimes slipped from the cranes, crashing to the ground below. Yet, despite the hazards, the builders continued their work, driven by the knowledge that they were part of something much greater than themselves. But as you observe the process, you also begin to notice something else. In the midst of all the noise and activity, the builders are not simply constructing a fortress. They are building a piece of history. The very stones they carry, carve, and arrange will one day stand as monuments to a bygone era. This castle, once completed, will not just be a military stronghold. It will become a part of the land, a part of the community, a symbol of the past for future generations. As you stand back, taking in the scope of the castle's construction, you begin to realize just how important this work truly is. The builder's craft is not just about creating a defensible structure, it's about shaping the future. The castle they are building will outlast them, becoming a physical representation of the society they helped shape. In a sense, these builders are laying the foundation for history itself. But here's the paradox. While the builder's work is essential to the castle's construction, their legacy is often overlooked. The lords and kings who lived within these walls may be remembered by name, but the workers who spent countless hours creating these structures are largely forgotten. Even as their work endures, their identities fade into the background, and yet their work, the quiet craft of building, has shaped the very nature of medieval society. Without the skill of the builders, the castles would not have stood. Without them, the medieval world would have looked very different. As the sun sets over the construction site, you might wonder how many of the great castles of the medieval world were truly the product of a single vision, or were they the result of hundreds of nameless laborers quietly working together, passing their knowledge down from generation to generation. In the shadows of these grand structures, there are stories of sweat, struggle, and quiet genius stories that have been lost to time, but that were critical to the creation of the medieval world as we know it. The sun rises again, casting its early light over the construction site. The workers return to their posts, the clink of hammers and the rhythm of their labor filling the air. Yet, despite the noise and the bustling activity, there is an underlying quietness to their lives. These builders, who spend their days shaping the stones that will form the walls of castles and cathedrals, are in many ways invisible to the world around them, while the lords who commissioned these grand structures live in the spotlight. The builders toil in the shadows. Their work is acknowledged only in the completion of the project, and their personal lives remain largely unnoticed. Yet, as you observe the construction site, it becomes clear that the lives of the builders themselves are integral to understanding the true impact of their craft. Consider the journey of one such builder, a man who grew up in a small village, learning the trade of stone masonry from his father. From a young age, he worked alongside his father, learning how to shape and carve stone, how to understand the bonds of a structure, and how to apply his craft to the creation of something far greater than himself. For him, building wasn't just a job, it was a family tradition, a legacy passed down through generations. As he grew older, he left his village to find work on larger construction projects, where he could earn a living wage and hone his craft. Over time, he became part of a traveling group of builders, moving from site to site as new castles and monasteries were commissioned. It wasn't an easy life. The work was grueling, the hours long, and the pay often meager. But for the builders, it was a life of purpose. They were part of a larger project, shaping the physical world in ways that were vital to the success of medieval society. This builder's daily life, however, was not just about stone and mortar. It was about the people with whom he worked. The workers on the construction site often came from different backgrounds. Some were experienced craftsmen, while others were simple laborers or apprentices learning the trade. The builders would work side by side, passing down their knowledge and skills, forming close bonds that would last for years. But there were also the less glamorous aspects of the job, the long hours, the dangerous work, and the constant struggle to survive. Accidents were common on the construction site. A misplaced stone could cause a fatal injury. A fall from a scaffold could end a life in an instant. For the builder, the risks were ever present, yet they were part of the reality of his world. Life on the construction site was hard, but it was also a chance for the builder to prove his skill and to earn his place among the craftsmen of the medieval world. And then there were the long stretches of time between projects. When the work on one castle was finished, the builder would find himself without a steady source of income, waiting for the next commission to come through. During these downtimes, he would return to his village or wander the countryside, seeking temporary work wherever he could find it. He might carve stone for a local church or help with the construction of a bridge, but no matter where he went, the builder was always looking for the next opportunity to prove himself. Though the builder might not have received the recognition he deserved, his work was central to the lives of the people around him. The castles and fortifications he helped to build were not just homes for the lords, they were centers of power, protection, and community. These buildings were the heart of medieval society. They represented safety and order in a chaotic world, and the builder's craft was vital to their creation. As you think about the lives of these builders, you begin to realize that their contribution was far more than just physical labor. They were creators of space, transforming raw materials into the very structures that supported medieval life. They crafted the environments in which history unfolded, giving shape to the castles and fortresses that served as the backdrop to the stories of kings, knights, and warriors. Without the builder, there would be no space for the battles, the political intrigue, or the drama that history has recorded. And yet, despite the immense role they played in shaping the world, the builders' stories often go untold. The names of the lords and kings may be remembered, but the builders remain anonymous, their contributions overshadowed by the grandiosity of the castles they created. But the builder's role is not just limited to the past. As you consider the impact of their work, you may find yourself reflecting on the importance of craftsmanship in today's world. How much of the modern world is shaped by the quiet hands of those who labor behind the scenes? And what would happen if we, as a society, took a moment to recognize their contribution, not just in the grand monuments they leave behind, but in the everyday work they do to build the world we live in? What do the builders of the past teach us about our own relationship with the work we do, the spaces we inhabit, and the legacy we leave behind? Is it possible that we, too, are shaping history in ways that we might never fully understand? As the day wanes and the builders finish their labor, the construction site begins to quiet. The master builder looks up at the towering walls they've crafted together, knowing that this is the culmination of years of effort. Though the structure still needs finishing touches, it stands tall against the horizon, a silent testament to the hands that shaped it. The walls, though cold and stoic, are filled with memories of the work, the sweat, and the sacrifices that went into their creation. These walls, after all, are not just walls. They are the legacy of the builders themselves. The builder may never see the final glory of the castle, for many of them would leave before its completion. Their names are not etched into the stonework. Their contributions are obscured in the grand narrative of history. Yet the castles they built would stand for centuries, each stone a reminder of their craftsmanship, their quiet dedication, and their role in shaping the medieval world. The structures they left behind became symbols of power, security, and civilization. In a world fraught with violence and political upheaval, the castles were meant to endure, and they did, enduring far beyond the lives of the builders who had crafted them. The stories of these builders were never written down. They did not leave behind grand records or detailed journals of their work. Instead, their stories were embedded in the very stones of the castles they built. As you walk through these castles today, you might marvel at the intricacy of the architecture, the towering keeps, the labyrinthine passageways, the delicate stone carvings. But what you may not realize is that each of these features carries the fingerprints of the builders who worked tirelessly to create them. The builder's role in the grand narrative of history is subtle, but it is undeniable. They were the backbone of medieval society, shaping the physical world in ways that influenced the political and cultural landscape. Without their craftsmanship, the castles, fortresses, and cathedrals that dotted the medieval world would never have stood. These structures were not just symbols of power, they were symbols of the labor, skill, and knowledge of those who had crafted them. Even today, these structures endure. As the centuries have passed, some castles have fallen into ruin, while others have been preserved as historical landmarks. In both cases, The builder's legacy lives on. When we walk through the halls of these ancient castles, we are walking in the footsteps of the builders who created them. Every arch, every stone, every carefully carved detail is a testament to their skill. In modern times, the legacy of the medieval builder is often overlooked. The lords, kings, and knights who lived within the castles may be celebrated in history books, their stories immortalized in grand tales, but the builders, the unsung heroes, remain in the background. Yet, as we look at the castles today, we begin to understand just how vital their contributions were. These structures were not only physical spaces, they were arenas of history. They held within their walls the stories of battles, politics, and power, and it was the builders who provided the stage for these dramas to unfold. What, then, is the lasting legacy of the medieval builders? It is more than just the stonework they left behind. It is the reminder that history is often shaped by those whose names are forgotten. The builders were not just laborers, they were architects of history, creating the very spaces in which the medieval world played out. Their craft has endured, and in that endurance, we find a powerful lesson. It is often the quiet, unnoticed labor that shapes the course of history in ways that are far more lasting than any battle or political triumph. As you stand in the shadow of the castle's towering walls, you might wonder how many other stories, like that of the builder, remain hidden in the corners of history. How many other laborers, craftsmen, and workers have shaped the world in ways we may never fully understand or appreciate. The builders of the medieval world may have been forgotten by name, but their work has lived on, quietly shaping the world we inherit today. The legacy of the builder, much like the legacy of the scribe, reminds us that history is not just made by the powerful or the famous. It is made by the hands of those who labor in silence, shaping the world around them. Their work, though often overlooked, is the foundation upon which everything else is built. And perhaps, in some small way, this quiet legacy calls to us as well. In our own work, whether visible or hidden, there is a sense of purpose that connects us to the builders of the past. Their craft lives on in us, in the way we create, build, and shape the world. Whether we are constructing literal walls or the metaphysical structures of our lives. The quiet revolution of medieval farmers. Imagine a field stretching out in all directions, the rich soil tilled and ready for the planting season. The air is cool with the early morning fog. The only sounds the distant calls of birds and the rhythmic hum of workers preparing the land. You might be standing among the farmers of the medieval world, men and women whose daily labor went largely unnoticed, yet whose work was the very bedrock of society. Without them, the castles and courts of the nobility would have crumbled, for it was the farmers who provided the food that sustained the kingdom. Medieval farming, much like the builder's work, is a story often overlooked. Yet it was the farmers, laboring in the fields year after year, who formed the backbone of medieval society. They didn't command armies, make laws, or live in grand castles, but their work was crucial to the survival of the kingdom. Without their hands working the land, the nobility would have had no wealth to draw from, no food to sustain their courts, and no foundation for the power they wielded. As you walk through the fields, you notice the careful, methodical way the farmers work. Their tools are simple, often just a plow, a sickle, or a scythe, but their knowledge of the land is immense. They know when to plant, when to harvest, and how to tend to the crops that feed the world. This knowledge, passed down through generations, was the key to their survival. The farmer's life was one of repetition, the cycle of planting and harvesting marking the passing of seasons. Yet, in this repetition lay a quiet power. The farmers knew that the success of the harvest would determine everything from the survival of their families to the strength of the kingdom. A poor harvest could lead to famine, social unrest, and the weakening of the entire social order. The farmer's role, though humble, was one of immense responsibility. You watch as the farmers work the land, their hands moving with practiced ease. Each stroke of the plow, each seed planted, is done with the knowledge that the future of the kingdom rests on their shoulders. The peasants, the laborers, and the farmers may not have held political power, but without them, the rest of society would have come to a halt. The land they tilled was the source of wealth for the nobility, the church, and even the monarchy itself. It is easy to overlook the significance of farming in the medieval period. The nobility lived in their castles, their wealth drawn from the land, but the wealth itself came not from gold or silver, but from the food that grew in these fields. It was the farmer who planted the crops that fed not only the local community, but the entire medieval economy. The harvest was the pulse of the medieval world, the measure of success, stability, and survival. And yet, despite the importance of their work, the farmers were often the lowest in the social hierarchy. They were bound to the land, working under the control of the lord who owned it. Their labor was grueling, their reward modest, and their freedom limited. The farmers worked long hours, often from dawn until dusk, with little time for rest or leisure. They lived in small, modest homes, often sharing space with animals to help keep warm during the cold winters. Despite their low status, the farmers of medieval Europe were essential to the functioning of the entire society. Their work ensured that the castles were supplied with food, that the monasteries had the resources to feed their monks, and that the army had enough to eat when it went to war. The kingdom's wealth was built on their backs, though the farmers rarely saw any of it. As you stand in the field, watching the farmers at work, you can't help but wonder, what was it like to live such a life? What did they think of their place in society, knowing that without their labor, the entire medieval structure would collapse? Did they feel the weight of their work, or did they find meaning in the simple act of tending to the earth? And perhaps most importantly, how did the farmers see the nobility, the kings, and the clergy who lived in luxury while they worked the land that made their wealth possible? As the seasons turn, the cycle of work continues. The farmers wake early to face another day in the fields, their routines deeply ingrained in the rhythm of the land. From spring to autumn, their lives are consumed with the planting, growing, and harvesting of crops. The work is physically demanding each day, filled with long hours under the harsh sun, with only brief moments of respite. It's a life bound by nature's rhythms, where the success of the harvest is the ultimate measure of their year. But the life of a medieval farmer was not only about hard work, it was also a life fraught with uncertainty. They had no control over the weather, which could be as much a threat to their livelihood as it was a source of sustenance. A summer drought could dry up the crops before they even had a chance to reach full growth, while excessive rain could wash away the seeds they had painstakingly planted. Famine, caused by poor harvests or sudden crop failures, was a constant fear. The farmer's livelihood, and often his survival, was tied to factors entirely beyond his control. The medieval farmer had to be resourceful, constantly adjusting to the shifting circumstances of the land. When faced with an unexpected drought or flood, they had to find ways to make the most of the resources available. They might redirect streams to water their fields or create intricate systems of irrigation. In times of food scarcity, they learned to stretch their resources, making do with what little they had. The resilience of the medieval farmer was not just in his work, but in his ability to adapt and survive in an environment that was often unforgiving. Despite these challenges, the farmer's role in society was essential. Though it was rarely acknowledged, the work they did in the fields ensured the stability of the kingdom. The peasants were the ones who provided the food that sustained the noble families and the clergy, whose lives were so vastly different from theirs. The fruits of the farmer's labor went into the castles, where lords and ladies feasted on rich meats and fine wines, while the farmers themselves rarely tasted the fruits of their own labor. While the lord's land was managed by overseers or stewards, the farmers themselves lived on the land as serfs, tied to it by a complex system of feudal obligations. They were often required to give a portion of their harvest to the Lord in exchange for the right to work the land and live on it. For the farmers, this meant that their hard-earned food often had to be surrendered to the Lord, leaving them with just enough to survive the next season. This system, known as the feudal levy, kept the farmers in a constant cycle of work and debt, with little chance of ever escaping their circumstances. But the system was not without its resistance. As difficult as life was for the medieval farmer, there were moments of rebellion and resistance against the burdens placed upon them. Throughout medieval Europe, farmers occasionally revolted against the feudal system, demanding better living conditions, fairer treatment, and relief from excessive taxes. The peasants' revolt in England in 1381 is one such example, a rare but significant moment where the farmers rose up against the system that oppressed them. Though the revolt was suppressed, it serves as a reminder that, despite their lower status, the farmers were not without agency. Even though their revolts were often short-lived, these uprisings had an impact. They forced the rulers to reconsider their treatment of the peasantry, and in some cases, led to reforms that offered farmers slightly better conditions. However, these were only brief moments of change in an otherwise rigid feudal system. The farmer's position remained largely the same throughout much of the medieval period, essential to the economy, but still at the mercy of forces beyond their control. What the medieval farmer lacked in political power, however, they made up for in resilience. They had to be inventive, finding new ways to grow crops, manage their land, and protect their livelihoods. They also had to be patient, for they lived by the seasons, knowing that their fate rested on the success of each harvest. The farmer's work, though rarely glamorous, was a cornerstone of medieval society, a quiet but constant force that kept the world turning. And yet, there was always the specter of hunger lurking. Even when the harvests were good, there were always other concerns: the rise of grain prices, the threat of famine from war or plague, the possibility that their land might be seized by a more powerful lord. The farmer's survival was never guaranteed. But despite the odds, they persevered. They found ways to survive and thrive in the harshest conditions. showing a quiet strength that, while often ignored, was central to the medieval world. As you reflect on the life of the farmer, you begin to realize how much of medieval society was shaped by the land. The farmer, though unseen by the courts and castles, was the one who truly held the kingdom together. Without their labor, there would be no food to feed the armies, no grain to bake the bread that would sustain the people. The medieval economy, as precarious as it was, could not function without the farmers who worked the fields. And as the day turns to night, with the farmers retiring to their small homes, you might wonder what would happen if the farmers decided to stop working, if they chose to abandon the fields and let the crops wither. How would the kingdom survive? And in a world where power was concentrated in the hands of the few, could the farmers, if united, have the power to reshape their world? The seasons pass, and as winter's chill sets in, the fields lie fallow, waiting for the first hints of spring. In the quiet of the village, the farmers gather to rest after months of hard labor. The work on the land, though paused for the moment, is never truly finished. The cycle continues, year after year, generation after generation. Yet, while their names may not be recorded in the annals of history, the legacy of the medieval farmer is quietly written in the landscape itself. The castles and cathedrals that stand tall today, their stone walls etched with the names of kings and queens, might seem to carry the full weight of history. The battles fought and won, the political intrigues of the nobility, and the achievements of the courts might be what we remember most vividly. But beneath the surface of all this grand history lies something far more enduring: the steady, unbroken labor of the farmers who made it all possible. The impact of medieval farmers wasn't just in what they produced, it was in how they shaped society. The land they worked and the crops they grew provided the foundation for medieval civilization. Without their labor, there would have been no wealth to support the nobility, no food to sustain the armies, and no foundation for the thriving towns and cities that began to emerge during this period. While kings and lords fought for power, it was the farmers who truly held the kingdom together. The crops they grew: wheat, barley, oats, rye fed not only the local village, but the larger economy. The grain harvested from their fields fed the knights and soldiers, the clergy and nobility, the traders and craftsmen who made up the bustling towns. The peasants' harvest was the fuel that powered the engine of medieval life. Without the farmers, society as it was known would have come to a grinding halt. But even as their labor formed the backbone of medieval society, the farmers were often taken for granted. While the nobility lived in relative luxury, the peasants endured a life of hard work and sacrifice. They were bound by feudal obligations to their lords, their lives governed by the cycles of the land and the whims of the weather. They paid taxes and rents in the form of grain, labor, or livestock, and their work was often exploited by the lords who controlled the land. Yet, despite this, they persisted. Through famine, plague, and war, they continued to work the land, their resilience forming the bedrock of the medieval economy. As the medieval period gave way to the Renaissance and the modern era, the role of the farmer began to change. The rise of cities and trade brought with it a growing need for more specialized labor, and the Industrial Revolution would eventually change the way food was produced. But the legacy of the medieval farmer remains, etched into the very soil they worked. The techniques they developed, from crop rotation to the use of animals and plowing, would become the foundation of modern agriculture. Even today, we can see the lasting impact of medieval farming practices, the cultivation of crops, the care of animals, and the management of the land. These are all skills and practices that trace their roots back to the farmers of the Middle Ages. While their lives may have been difficult and their contributions overlooked, their legacy endures in the food we eat, the land we cultivate, and the way our societies function. The farmer's quiet strength is something we often overlook in our modern world. We live in cities, buy our food from stores, and rarely think about where it comes from or who made it possible. But the farmers of the medieval world remind us that even the most unassuming labor can have an immeasurable impact. Their work was not just a means of survival, it was the very foundation upon which society was built. The medieval farmer's story is a quiet one, marked by toil and struggle, but also by resilience and perseverance. Their labor shaped the medieval world, and their legacy continues to shape our world today. We may never know the names of those who worked the land, but their contributions cannot be forgotten. The very fabric of history woven with the labor of the farmers is the thread that runs through the medieval period and continues to hold our world together. As the final harvest is gathered and the fields lie dormant under the winter's frost, we are reminded that the true story of the medieval world is not just found in the castles or the battles, but in the quiet, humble labor of those who worked the land. Their legacy is not etched in stone or ink, but in the very soil beneath our feet. The farmer, like the builder and the scribe, may be overlooked by history, but their impact is undeniable. Perhaps it is in this quiet labor, this unnoticed work, that the true spirit of history lies. How much of our own lives is shaped by the invisible hands of laborers, workers, and farmers whose names we will never know? What legacies are being quietly created today, not in grand monuments or achievements, but in the steady, uncelebrated work of everyday life? The silent architects of medieval art, stained glass, and the stories they told. Imagine yourself standing at the base of a medieval cathedral, your head tilted back, your eyes drawn upwards to the towering arches and the intricate stained glass windows that decorate the walls. The sunlight filters through the glass, casting a kaleidoscope of colors onto the stone floor. The scene is magnificent, yet it seems almost out of place in the quiet grandeur of the cathedral. This burst of color and light, this unexpected beauty, comes from the work of artists whose hands are rarely remembered by history. They were the stained glass makers, the unsung architects of light, whose craftsmanship has lived on for centuries. Stained glass windows were a feature of almost every cathedral in medieval Europe. These windows were not only decorative, they were symbolic. The vibrant colors and intricate designs told stories, conveyed religious messages, and created an atmosphere of awe and reverence in the holy space. Yet, while we remember the cathedrals and the great artists of the time, we rarely consider the craftsmen who created the glass itself. Their work was just as integral to the cathedral's power and presence, and yet they were often left out of the grand narratives of history. As you step inside the cathedral, you are immediately struck by the play of light and color. The windows tell stories from the Bible, scenes of saints and angels, of the life of Christ and the Virgin Mary, all rendered in brilliant hues of blue, red, yellow, and green. These scenes are not just works of art, they are visual sermons. designed to educate the illiterate masses who could not read the Bible for themselves. The stained glass was the medieval equivalent of a visual storytelling medium, one that conveyed deep theological and moral lessons without the need for words. The process of creating stained glass was a labor intensive art, one that required a great deal of skill and precision. The glass was not simply painted or drawn upon, it was crafted and shaped into intricate patterns and scenes. The first step in creating a stained glass window was selecting the right glass. The glass was typically made by heating sand, soda, and lime to create a molten liquid, which was then blown or rolled into sheets. The glass had to be perfect, free of bubbles and flaws. After the sheets were prepared, the artist would sketch out the design on paper, carefully planning the scenes and patterns that would be depicted. Once the design was finalized, the artist would cut the glass into pieces using a special tool that was capable of shaping the fragile material. Each piece of glass was then painted with intricate designs using a mixture of powdered glass and pigments. The paint was fired in a kiln, bonding it to the glass. After the paint had cooled, the artist would carefully assemble the pieces into a frame, joining them with strips of lead, which were then soldered together. The level of detail and precision required was extraordinary. A single window could take months, even years, to complete, depending on its size and complexity. The artist would work under immense pressure to create something that was not only beautiful, but also a powerful tool for religious instruction. The windows were designed to draw the viewer's eye upwards, towards the heavens, inspiring awe and contemplation, but they were also meant to teach. The scenes depicted in the glass were visual narratives, helping the illiterate to understand the stories of the Bible and the lives of the saints. Yet, despite the importance of their work, the stained glass artists were often invisible. They were craftsmen working behind the scenes, their names rarely recorded in the annals of history. They did not enjoy the fame or recognition of the architects or the noble patrons who funded the cathedrals. Instead, they were the humble artisans who, through their skill and creativity, brought light and color into the lives of the people. Their work was integral to the cathedral's spiritual and visual impact, but it was largely overlooked. The significance of stained glass, however, went beyond its beauty. It was a symbol of the divine, an embodiment of the connection between the earthly and the heavenly. The play of light through the colored glass was seen as a reflection of God's presence in the world. The windows allowed light to flood the dark, stone interiors of the cathedral, transforming them into spaces of transcendent beauty. The light itself was considered sacred, and the glass through which it passed was seen as a conduit for divine grace. As you stand in the nave, surrounded by the colors and the light, you realize that the stained glass windows are more than just decoration. They are a reflection of the medieval worldview. They embody the belief that beauty and spirituality were intertwined, that the divine could be seen not just in the heavens, but in the very fabric of the world around us. The windows, with their vivid colors and intricate scenes, were designed to elevate the soul, to take it from the mundane to the sacred. But as you admire the windows, a thought crosses your mind. How many of the artists who created these masterpieces remain nameless? How many of them spent their lives crafting these stories in glass, their hands stained with paint and their eyes strained from hours of delicate work, only to have their names lost to time? And yet, their legacy lives on in the very fabric of these cathedrals. Would the impact of these windows have been the same if the hands that created them had not been so skilled, so dedicated to their craft? As you stand beneath the kaleidoscope of colors, the cathedral's stained glass windows seem almost alive, glowing with a quiet vibrancy. You begin to understand that these windows were not just beautiful, they were an intricate puzzle, a blend of artistic vision, craftsmanship, and skill. Each shard of glass, painstakingly cut and painted, was a piece of the larger story that was being told. But behind every window, behind every pane of glass, there were challenges and sacrifices, ones that few ever saw. Imagine the life of the stained glass artist, often an anonymous figure working in the background of grand architectural projects. The artist's workshop was small, often dark, and cluttered with tools, pigments, and the raw materials of their craft. The life of a stained glass maker was one of precision and patience, where mistakes were not easily forgiven. A single crack in a piece of glass, a misstep in the painting, or a slip of the hand while cutting the glass could mean starting the process all over again. This labor wasn't for the faint of heart. It required immense dedication and an unwavering focus on the task at hand. The artist would spend countless hours working on the windows, sometimes alone, sometimes in small workshops with other craftsmen. They would carefully mix their pigments to achieve the right shades, making sure each color would reflect the light in the way they intended. This process was a combination of science and artistry, understanding how the different colors of glass would behave in the light, how they would interact with each other to create a harmonious design. And yet, the stained glass artists were often invisible in the eyes of those they were working for, while the architects, the lords, and the religious leaders who commissioned the windows would receive the praise. The artists were often forgotten. The same could be said of the laborers who assisted them, often working in the background to help cut the glass or assemble the windows. For many of these artisans, their work was not celebrated. It was simply a part of the everyday construction process, a task that was expected and paid for, but rarely acknowledged as an art in itself. The work was not only physically demanding, it was emotionally exhausting. For the artist, each window was a spiritual undertaking. They weren't just creating something beautiful, they were creating something that would inspire devotion and reflect the divine. The pressure to live up to these expectations could be immense. The artist was not merely an artisan, they were an interpreter of divine light, tasked with translating religious stories into a visual medium that would speak to the soul. But it was not just the pressures of their craft that made the stained glass artist's life difficult. The conditions in which they worked were far from ideal. Workshops were often cramped, with poor ventilation and inadequate lighting. The tools they used, hammers, anvils, and kilns, were heavy and dangerous. Many artists suffered from physical ailments, such as respiratory issues from the fumes and dust, as well as injuries from handling the delicate glass and metal. Yet despite these hardships, the stained glass artists pushed on. Their dedication to their craft was a testament to their resilience and their belief in the importance of the work they were doing. As the artist worked, they often had little control over the design itself. While some commissions allowed for creative freedom, many stained glass windows were dictated by religious orders or the vision of the patron commissioning the work. The artist's job was to execute the vision, to bring to life the scenes of Christ's life, the saints, and the biblical stories in ways that would resonate with the viewers. The designs were often dictated by tradition, and the artists had to work within these established boundaries. Despite the constraints, the stained glass artists still managed to infuse their own artistic touches into their work. From the choice of colors to the subtle details and the expressions of figures, the artists found ways to make each window unique. The windows became more than just depictions of religious scenes. They were reflections of the artist's own interpretation of the divine, of the light that passed through the glass, and of the stories they so carefully depicted. But it was not only the artisans who faced challenges, it was the very medium of stained glass itself. The material was fragile, vulnerable to damage from weather, war, and time. Over the centuries, many windows have been lost, either shattered in battles or decayed from the elements. The artistry of those who created them is often only glimpsed through the remnants of glass, the outlines of lost scenes preserved in fragments. Today, when we look at the stained glass windows in medieval cathedrals, we see them as relics of a bygone era, their beauty still resonating through the centuries. Yet, as we admire the intricate details, we must remember the men and women who painstakingly crafted them. These artists were not just skilled laborers, they were storytellers, spiritual guides, and craftsmen. Their work endured through war, neglect, and the passage of time, not because of grand fame or recognition, but because of the beauty and meaning that was imbued in every piece of glass. As the light continues to pour through the windows, filling the cathedral with color, you might wonder, what would these artists have thought of the future? Did they know that their work would live on far beyond their own lifetimes? Or were they too focused on the task at hand, too immersed in the intricacies of their craft, to ever consider the legacy they would leave behind? As the cathedral fills with the soft hues of twilight, the light filtering through the stained glass windows gradually shifts, casting a golden glow on the stone floors. The play of colors, vivid reds, blues, greens, and purples imbues the space with a sense of reverence. The light, once mundane and harsh, now feels otherworldly, as though the divine itself is being channeled through these works of art. And yet, despite the majestic presence of these windows, there is something inherently tragic about the artists who created them. They were often forgotten, their lives and struggles obscured by time. The legacy of the stained glass artists is not found in written records or in the fame of their names, but in the enduring beauty of their work. As you gaze at the intricate depictions of biblical stories, saints, and angels, it becomes clear that the windows are not just reflections of the medieval worldview. They are windows into the souls of the artists themselves. Each stroke of paint, each cut of glass, each tiny detail speaks of a laborious devotion to a craft that transcended the simple act of creation. The windows were their testament, their legacy, and for many, it was all they would leave behind. Throughout the centuries, these stained glass windows have weathered countless trials, wars, fires, and neglect. Some windows have been lost forever, their fragile glass shattered in the throes of battle or torn apart by time. Others, though cracked and faded, continue to stand in the shadow of their creators, their vibrant colors muted, but still speaking of the craftsmanship and devotion that went into them. The survival of these windows is a testament to the resilience of the artisans themselves, and yet It is not just the physicality of the glass that endures, it is the profound sense of artistry and devotion embedded within them. Despite the hardships they faced, the stained glass artists of the medieval world changed the way we understand art, light, and religion. They used their craft to bridge the gap between the divine and the earthly, creating an experience that would transport viewers from the mundane world into something greater. Their art was not simply a decoration, it was a tool for spiritual reflection and a means of connecting with the divine. For centuries, people would have stood before these windows, their eyes tracing the painted stories, their minds drawn to the sacred imagery. The windows became more than just pictures, they became portals to the divine, channels for divine light that illuminated not only the cathedral, but also the hearts and minds of the people who gazed upon them. In the modern age, the legacy of medieval stained glass is perhaps more important than ever. As our world becomes increasingly disconnected from the sacred and the spiritual, the windows in these cathedrals remind us of a time when art was seen as a direct means of connecting with the divine. The windows, though, of another time continue to inspire awe and reflection. They remind us of the power of light, of the quiet work that often goes unnoticed, and of the deeply human desire to reach beyond the physical world and touch the divine. But the story of the stained glass artists is not just one of art and beauty. It is a story of resilience in the face of obscurity. These artists, working in the shadows of the cathedral, were often not given the recognition they deserved. Their names were rarely recorded, their lives forgotten, yet their work endured. It is a reminder to Shamer that some of the most important contributions to history are made by those whose names remain unknown. These artists did not seek fame or recognition. Their work was their devotion, their spiritual calling, and their legacy. Today, as we admire the windows in the grand cathedrals and churches, we should remember not only the beauty they provide, but the unseen labor that went into their creation. These windows were not simply art, they were a sacred act of creation, a manifestation of the artist's faith, skill, and devotion. They were meant to last for centuries, and indeed, they have. So, as the sun sets behind the cathedral and the last rays of light pass through the stained glass, you may find yourself reflecting on the hidden stories of those who made such beauty possible. What were their lives like? What did they sacrifice for their craft? Did they know the impact their work would have centuries later? And perhaps most importantly, what does it mean to create something that outlives us? The stained glass artists remind us that even in the most humble, unnoticed labor, there can be profound meaning, and that their work, though silent and often invisible, still speaks to us today. The forgotten healers of the medieval world, apothecaries and herbalists. Picture a garden, not of ornamental flowers, but of life-saving plants. You walk through rows of herbs, each one carefully tended to by the apothecaries and herbalists of the medieval world. The air is fragrant with the earthy scent of sage, rosemary, and thyme. In this quiet garden, tucked away from the hustle of the bustling village or town, the secrets of medieval medicine are hidden in plain sight. It is here, amid the plants and the simple tools, that the apothecaries worked to heal, alleviate pain, and sometimes save lives. In the medieval period, medical knowledge was far from advanced by modern standards. But that did not mean healing was without its methods or its wisdom. The apothecaries, often overlooked by history, were essential figures in medieval society. They were not physicians in the sense we understand today, but they were the ones who knew how to treat everyday ailments, prepare remedies, and craft concoctions that could soothe the body and mind. Their work was rooted in centuries of knowledge passed down through generations, blending folk traditions with the limited scientific understanding of the time. The apothecary's workshop was a place of both science and art. It was filled with jars of dried herbs, bottles of tinctures, and containers of powders, all organized in a way that only the apothecary understood. For the people in medieval towns and villages, these workshops were often the first place they turned to when illness struck. There were no hospitals in the modern sense, and doctors were few and far between, often too expensive for the common folk to afford. But the apothecary was accessible and, in many cases, the first line of defense against illness and injury. As you step into the small, dimly lit space, you are immediately struck by the scent of dried flowers, crushed leaves, and the occasional waft of something more pungent, like garlic or vinegar. Shelves line the walls, filled with bundles of herbs, wooden mortars, and pestles. A large wooden counter stands at the center of the room, where the apothecary prepares their concoctions. On one side, you see a simple but well-worn book, a manuscript filled with recipes and instructions passed down through generations. The apothecary, often a person of humble origin, was well versed in the use of plants, minerals, and other natural substances to treat common ailments, fever, coughs, wounds, digestive issues. These were just some of the conditions that the apothecary could address with the herbs and remedies they had on hand. The process of preparing these remedies, however, was not a simple one. It required not only knowledge of the healing properties of plants, but also the skill to combine them into effective treatments. For example, to treat a fever, the apothecary might use a combination of willow bark, which contained salicylic acid, the precursor to modern aspirin, along with elderflower and chamomile, to help reduce inflammation and induce perspiration. Wounds might be treated with a poultice made from yarrow, known for its ability to staunch bleeding. If someone had a sore throat, they might be given a warm drink of honey and lemon mixed with thyme, a herb known for its antiseptic properties. But healing was not only about mixing herbs and concoctions. The apothecary also had to act as a listener, a confidant for those seeking relief. Patients would come into the shop, often bringing their concerns and fears with them. For many, the apothecary was a source of comfort in times of illness, offering not just remedies, but reassurance. There was a deep trust between the apothecary and the community, built not on medical science, but on experience and word of mouth. Despite their importance, the apothecaries faced challenges. Many of their remedies were based on ancient texts or folk traditions that were not always scientifically sound. The boundaries between medicine and superstition were often blurred. They used rituals, charms, and potions, sometimes relying on the mystical or spiritual to accompany their healing practices. While some of their treatments were effective, others could have been harmful, based on misguided beliefs or poorly understood concepts of the body. Yet, even in a time when many treatments were rudimentary at best, the apothecaries played a vital role in maintaining health and wellness in medieval society. They were an essential part of the healthcare system, providing remedies to the ill and tending to the wounds of soldiers and peasants alike. They were also crucial during times of plague and epidemics, even if their efforts were often overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the diseases. As you watch the apothecary work, you begin to appreciate the quiet dedication involved in their craft. The job was not glamorous, nor did it come with the prestige of the physicians who treated the noble classes, but the apothecary's work was indispensable. They were not only healers, but also teachers, passing on knowledge to apprentices and the next generation of herbalists. They formed a vital part of the community's social fabric, helping people navigate the inevitable cycles of illness and health. But as you think about their life, a lingering question arises. How many of these apothecaries were ever remembered? How many of their remedies were lost to time, replaced by modern medicine, or discarded as ineffective? And perhaps most haunting of all, how many of their lives were forgotten, despite the profound impact they had on the well-being of their communities? As you watch the apothecary work, mixing various herbs and powders, you begin to see the complexity of their world. Though their trade was primarily based on healing, the apothecaries were also deeply entwined with the more mystical and spiritual practices of the time. Their work often straddled the line between science and superstition, where remedies were as much about faith and belief as they were about physical healing. This connection between magic and medicine was not an anomaly in the medieval world. It was a fundamental part of the apothecary's role. In medieval Europe, belief in the supernatural was widespread, and illness was often seen as a manifestation of divine will, demonic influence, or bad luck. The apothecary, therefore, was not just someone who mixed herbs to treat ailments. They were also involved in the broader spiritual and magical practices that surrounded healing. Some apothecaries were thought to possess knowledge of how to ward off evil spirits or break curses, while others were believed to have the power to invoke blessings through prayers or charms. The dual nature of their work, rooted in both natural remedies and magical practices, made the apothecary a somewhat ambiguous figure. To the common people, they were revered as knowledgeable healers, with access to the secrets of nature that could not only heal, but also protect. But to the church and the more learned physicians, their use of potions, incantations, and charms placed them in a gray area. While the apothecary's herbal remedies might be accepted, their reliance on folk magic and superstitions was not always viewed favorably. At the time, medicine was far from the well-defined practice it would become in later centuries. Physicians who were often more educated, but far less accessible to the common folk, would rely on theories from ancient texts, particularly those of Hippocrates and Galen, and the treatments they prescribed were often more abstract and philosophical. In contrast, the apothecary was grounded in practical knowledge, passed down through apprenticeships and local traditions. This made them the go-to figures for day-to-day health concerns, yet it also made them vulnerable to accusations of quackery, especially when their treatments involved things like magic spells or rituals. The apothecary's shop was not merely a place for buying remedies, it was a space of community interaction, where people came not only for healing, but also for guidance. Some people, particularly in times of plague or famine, would visit an apothecary seeking comfort as much as a cure. The apothecary was often a listener, someone who understood the fears and anxieties of the people they served. Their role was not simply to dispense medicine, but also to provide reassurance in times of uncertainty. This human connection, though often underappreciated, was one of the most important aspects of their practice. But this practice of blending medicine with magic was not without risks. The more spiritual elements of the apothecary's work could attract suspicion, particularly in a society where the church held considerable power. Apothecaries often found themselves walking a fine line between their practical work and their involvement in the mystical or esoteric. Herbal remedies and potions might be seen as acceptable, but the use of incantations or charms to ward off evil could be viewed as heretical or superstitious. During times of intense religious scrutiny, especially during the Inquisition, many apothecaries and healers found themselves accused of witchcraft. It was a dangerous accusation, one that could lead to trial, torture, or execution. In these turbulent periods, many of those who practiced folk medicine, particularly women, were targeted as witches for their use of herbs or their practice of magic. The line between healer and witch was often blurred, and those who worked in the shadows of medieval society, providing care to those who were ill or in pain, could suddenly find themselves on the wrong side of the law. Despite the risks, the apothecaries continued their work, for they were integral to the survival of the people, particularly the poor. They treated fevers, toothaches, and infections ailments that the more educated physicians were often too distant or too expensive to address. Their remedies were sometimes all that stood between life and death. The apothecary's herbal knowledge, passed down over generations, was far more than a simple trade. It was a lifeline for the common people. As you reflect on the apothecary's role in the community, it becomes clear that they were much more than mere healers. They were stewards of an ancient tradition, blending art, science, and spirituality in a way that allowed them to provide a holistic form of care. They balanced the practical and the mystical, using both herbs and prayers to heal the body and the soul. But this role, though vital, was often marginalized. The apothecary's work, while central to the lives of the common people, was often overshadowed by the more prestigious practices of the royal physicians or the learned scholars who studied medicine at universities. Their work was seen as simple, rooted in folklore and superstition, even though it was the apothecaries who often kept people alive through the harshest of times. This disconnect between the highborn and the common healer left the apothecary in a strange, liminal space in medieval society, valued but not fully appreciated. What, then, can we learn from the apothecaries of the medieval world? Perhaps it is the reminder that healing is not just a matter of science, but also of compassion, of understanding the spiritual and emotional needs of those in pain. The apothecaries embodied this holistic approach to health, where physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being were all part of the same process. They understood that the body could not be healed without also addressing the mind and soul. As the last herbs are gathered from the garden and the apothecary closes shop for the night, you might wonder how many of these healers went unrecognized, their names lost to time. How many lives did they touch, and how many of their remedies, effective or not, helped to alleviate suffering in a world where pain and illness were constant companions? As night falls over the medieval village, the apothecary locks the door to their shop, their day's work completed. Yet, the legacy of their craft lives on in subtle ways, woven into the fabric of modern medicine and society. Their healing methods, their intimate connection with the land, and their holistic approach to health continue to influence the world today, even if we no longer recognize them by name. In the medieval period, apothecaries were crucial to the survival of the common people. Their ability to work with herbs, minerals, and other natural substances to create medicines was not just about physical healing. It was also about providing comfort and stability in an uncertain world. In times of plague, famine, or war, the apothecary was often the first point of contact for those who were ill. They would mix potions, concoctions, and poultices to alleviate suffering, sometimes working miracles when no other options were available. Yet, as you reflect on their role in society, it becomes clear that their work was not just about the physical act of healing. It was about offering hope in a world where death was a constant companion and medical knowledge was rudimentary at best. The apothecary's work helped maintain a sense of continuity and security when illness struck and there was no understanding of the causes. The apothecary offered a lifeline, a promise that healing was possible, even if the path to it was uncertain. They were both healers and comforters, offering not just a remedy, but a sense of control over something as uncontrollable as disease and death. However, despite their importance, the apothecaries often went unrecognized. Their names were not recorded in the annals of history, and their contributions were often overshadowed by the more prestigious work of royal physicians or scholars. The herbal remedies they prepared, though sometimes crude by modern standards, were essential to the survival of the people, and while many of their treatments may seem quaint or even superstitious to us now, they were part of a long tradition of healing knowledge, passed down through generations. Today, we see the apothecary's legacy in many areas of modern life. The very foundations of modern pharmacology, pharmaceuticals, and treatments that have saved countless lives are rooted in the herbs and compounds that medieval apothecaries worked with. The science of plant-based medicine, though more refined today, traces its origins to the work of these medieval healers. Many of the plants that the apothecaries used to treat everything from fevers to digestive disorders are still used in modern medicine, albeit in more controlled and scientifically studied forms. Take, for example, the willow bark that the apothecary used to reduce fever. Today, we know that it contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. The medicinal use of willow bark dates back thousands of years, and it was the apothecaries who kept this knowledge alive during the medieval period. Likewise, herbs like garlic, lavender, and chamomile used by apothecaries for everything from digestion to relaxation remain staples in herbal medicine today. But even beyond the physical remedies, the apothecary's holistic approach to health continues to influence modern healthcare. Today, there is a growing recognition of the importance of mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being in medical care. The medieval apothecary understood that healing was not just about addressing physical symptoms. It was about restoring balance to the body, mind, and spirit. This integrated approach is now being embraced by many healthcare practitioners who recognize the importance of treating the whole person rather than just focusing on isolated symptoms. While we have made great strides in modern medicine, there is still much to learn from the apothecaries of the past. Their deep knowledge of herbs and natural remedies, their commitment to the well-being of their communities, and their ability to adapt to the challenges of their time offer valuable lessons. We live in an age where advanced medical technologies and scientific discoveries are making incredible strides. But sometimes we forget the roots of healing roots that reach back to the humble, dedicated apothecary. Even as we stand on the shoulders of centuries of medical progress, we must not overlook the contributions of those who came before us. The apothecaries were the silent architects of health, their work often unnoticed yet indispensable. They formed a bridge between the ancient wisdom of herbal medicine and the scientific breakthroughs of the future. Their legacy lives on, not only in the medicines we take, but in the very principles of care and compassion that continue to guide the practice of healing today. As you stand in the dim light of the apothecary's shop, surrounded by the jars of herbs and potions, it's impossible not to feel a sense of gratitude for the forgotten healers of the medieval world. They may have worked in the shadows, but their impact was far reaching, their contributions continuing to shape the way we approach health and healing even today. And so, as you leave the shop and step out into the cool night, you are left with a thought. In a world that often prizes fame and recognition, how much of the true legacy of history lies in the hands of those who worked quietly, humbly, and with great devotion to others? How many of their names have been lost, but their contributions still echo in our lives today? The rise and fall of medieval guilds, masters of craft and commerce. Imagine walking through the narrow, cobbled streets of a medieval town, the sounds of hammering, the smell of freshly baked bread, and the hustle of artisans filling their shops with goods echo in the air. As you move deeper into the heart of the town, you arrive at the district where craftsmen gather the guilds. These guilds, though often hidden in the daily bustle of life, were the lifeblood of the medieval economy. They represented the power of collective work, where artisans, merchants, and craftsmen banded together not just to create goods, but to protect their rights, preserve their trades, and control the flow of commerce in the region. Guilds were powerful institutions in the medieval world. They were the organized, collective bodies of workers from various trades, ranging from blacksmiths and weavers to carpenters and masons. But guilds weren't just about producing goods. They were about regulating work, training the next generation of artisans, and ensuring that standards were maintained across the board. The medieval guilds were the foundation of the medieval economy, providing a framework for not only the craft industries, but also for commerce and trade. In the bustling guild halls, you can hear the lively conversations of skilled men and women. Here, the artisans, who might otherwise have been independent, are united by common goals. As a member of the guild, they are bound by a set of rules, ensuring quality control, setting prices, and creating a sense of solidarity that benefits everyone involved. The guilds were often one of the few places where workers, many of them peasants or laborers by birth, could gain access to social power and influence. Membership in a guild could elevate one's status, granting access to better resources, networks, and even protection from the political turmoil that might shake the kingdom. As you walk through the bustling streets and peer into the workshops, you realize that the work being done is not just about the individual. It is the result of years of apprenticeship, where young workers learn the craft from experienced masters in a world where education was limited, especially for the lower classes. Becoming a member of a guild was the primary route to skill building and upward mobility. The guilds were institutions of learning and expertise, where knowledge was passed down from generation to generation, preserving valuable trades for future generations. Each guild had its own specific role, ensuring that goods were produced to a certain standard and that those goods were sold at a fair price. A baker's guild, for example, would regulate the weight and price of bread, ensuring that customers could trust what they were buying. The Weaver's Guild would establish the quality of cloth, regulating everything from the strength of the fabric to the dyes used in production. It was a way of ensuring that no one could undermine the integrity of the product by cutting corners or selling inferior goods. The guilds weren't just about protecting the interests of the artisans, they were also about controlling commerce. Many guilds had the exclusive right to trade certain goods in specific markets. They had powerful political leverage, often working closely with local lords and even monarchs to secure trade agreements and monopolies. Through their collective influence, guilds could negotiate better conditions for their members, demand higher wages, and ensure that their craftsmanship was valued. This power was built upon a foundation of trust, quality, and solidarity, where every member had a stake in maintaining the guild's reputation. But as you stand in the heart of the guild's influence, it's also clear that the guild's power could be a double-edged sword. They didn't just protect their members, they also excluded outsiders. The guilds maintained strict rules on who could join and under what conditions. Entry into a guild wasn't simply a matter of skill, it required a social network, wealth, and often family connections. For many talented artisans, the door to the guild was closed due to the rigid regulations and competition for membership. These rules, while protecting the quality of goods and the power of the guilds, also created barriers that prevented many from rising through the ranks, particularly those from the lower classes. This exclusionary nature created tension, particularly as the medieval economy began to shift. As towns grew larger and more diversified, so too did the number of individuals seeking to enter the crafts. The guilds, once a symbol of solidarity and empowerment for the working class, started to become symbols of elitism and restriction, preventing new blood from entering the marketplace. Over time, this created a fracture between the guilds and the broader working class, eventually contributing to their decline. The guilds were also bound by tradition, and as time passed, many of their structures became increasingly rigid. While the guilds helped to regulate quality and maintain order in the medieval economy, they were less adaptable to the changes brought by the Renaissance and the rise of early capitalism. The expanding world of trade and the growing importance of individual entrepreneurship presented challenges to the guild system, and slowly, their influence began to wane. Still, as you reflect on the guilds and their role in medieval society, it's clear that they were a foundational part of the economy, offering protection and structure to the workers who powered the towns and cities. The guilds were not just about the production of goods, they were the centers of social life, economic stability, and political influence. They provided a sense of community for workers, elevated the quality of craftsmanship, and, for a time, ensured that the common people had a voice in the economic affairs of their cities. But as the medieval period transitioned into the Renaissance, the guild's grip on commerce and trade slowly loosened. The rise of independent merchants, new market forces, and the increasing power of the state would soon challenge the very structures the guilds had spent centuries building. As you stand amidst the bustling streets of the medieval town, a sense of change hangs in the air. The guilds, once the powerful and unifying force of the economy, are beginning to feel the strain of a changing world. The rise of early capitalism, the growth of market towns, and the increasing influence of the monarchs are all shifting the power dynamics that had long favored the collective control of the guilds. The very systems that had once protected artisans are now beginning to stifle innovation and progress. The decline of the guilds didn't happen overnight. For centuries, the guilds were the heart of medieval craftsmanship and commerce. But as the Renaissance dawned, the needs of the economy began to evolve. The guilds, with their rigid rules and exclusive membership, started to feel less relevant in a world that was increasingly driven by individual enterprise and competition. New trade routes were opening up, wealth was flowing in from overseas, and the idea of free markets began to take root. The old methods, once so effective at controlling production and maintaining quality, began to feel increasingly antiquated. One of the biggest challenges the guilds faced was their lack of flexibility. Their power was built on monopolies and strict regulations, which, while protecting their members, also limited growth. Only those who could afford to pay the entry fees or who had the right family connections could gain membership. This system, while initially successful, began to shut out new talent and innovation. As the economy expanded, many talented artisans were left on the outside, unable to break into the system. At the same time, the rise of the merchant class began to change the way business was done. Merchants, who were often outside the influence of the guilds, began to play an increasingly important role in the economy. They dealt in goods from across Europe and beyond, importing exotic spices, silk, and luxury items, while exporting local goods. With this new wealth came the freedom to operate outside the restrictions of the guild system. As the merchant class grew, so did their influence. They were more willing to take risks, set their own prices, and work in unregulated markets. This new spirit of entrepreneurship clashed with the structured world of the guilds, which relied on fixed wages and tightly controlled pricing. With the growing power of merchants, monarchs began to see the potential for centralizing power. They realized that the guilds, with their independent nature and local influence, could pose a challenge to the growing authority of the state. As kings and queens began to consolidate power, they increasingly sided with the merchants and free traders, offering them incentives and protection in exchange for loyalty. The state, with its newfound ability to tax and regulate, began to diminish the power of the guilds, who had once enjoyed relative autonomy in their own localities. At the same time, advancements in technology were transforming the way goods were produced. The introduction of new machinery, particularly in textiles and metalworking, required a different kind of workforce. The traditional methods of crafting goods by hand, which had been central to the guild system, were increasingly being replaced by factory-style production. These changes rendered the guild's traditional methods of regulating work and controlling production obsolete. The rise of factories and mass production meant that individual artisans no longer had the same level of control over their work or the market. This shift in production methods signaled the beginning of the end for the guilds. As factory-based economies became more dominant, the guilds found themselves unable to keep up with the pace of industrialization. Many guilds began to lose their influence, and their once dominant role in commerce gradually faded. Artisans who once worked under the protective umbrella of guild membership found themselves working for wages in factories, no longer masters of their craft, but workers in a system driven by efficiency and profit. But even as the guilds began to lose their grip on the economy, their legacy endured. The guilds had played a crucial role in shaping the world we live in today. They had been the first institutions to regulate work, ensure quality, and provide support for craftsmen. The spirit of craftsmanship, collaboration, and the pursuit of excellence that the guilds fostered still resonates in modern industries. The apprentice system, which allowed young workers to learn from masters, laid the foundation for modern education and training in trades. The guilds had provided a framework for the development of specialized skills and a professional workforce, a model that would later be adapted by other industries and sectors. The decline of the guilds also paved the way for new forms of labor organization. While the guilds themselves faded, the idea of collective action, of workers coming together to protect their interests, continued to evolve. Labor unions, which would emerge centuries later, owe much to the lessons learned from the guilds. The guilds' focus on solidarity, quality control, and fair wages influenced the development of modern labor movements that sought to improve conditions for workers in the industrial age. Despite their decline, the guilds left behind a rich legacy that shaped not only the economy of medieval Europe, but also the broader world. They were the pioneers of organized labor and professional trade, creating the blueprint for many of the systems we rely on today. The values they championed, community, craftsmanship, and the protection of the worker, still resonate in modern societies. As you walk through the now bustling town, once the heart of the guild system, you realize that the shadows of the guilds are still present. The architecture, the marketplaces, and the very layout of the town have been influenced by the guilds that once thrived here. Though the system that supported them is long gone, the craftsmanship and community that defined the guilds live on in the work of modern artisans, craftsmen, and laborers. The legacy of the guilds is a reminder that history is not just about the great rulers and warriors who shape nations. It is also about the everyday people who, through their work and their collective efforts, build the foundations upon which societies stand. As the centuries passed, the decline of the medieval guilds marked a significant turning point in the development of global commerce and labor. The guilds that once held such power in medieval towns were replaced by more modern economic systems, but their influence remains embedded in the structure of trade, craft, and labor movements today. The principles of solidarity, professional standards, and regulation they championed have shaped the very fabric of modern society. One of the most enduring legacies of the medieval guilds is the apprenticeship system. Under the guilds, young apprentices were taught the skills of a trade by masters, learning the craft from the ground up in a way that preserved the highest standards of quality. This system, built on years of tutelage and hands-on learning, laid the foundation for many of the vocational training programs we see today. The idea that a profession should require a specific set of skills, honed over time, continues to be reflected in the way we view professional qualifications in modern society. The guilds were also pioneers in the regulation of commerce. They were the first to establish clear standards for products, ensuring that goods were produced with quality and reliability in mind. Though much of the market today is driven by profit margins and efficiency, the Guild's emphasis on quality control can still be seen in industries where reputation and brand matter, such as luxury goods, specialized craftsmanship, and even modern services. In a world where mass production often dominates, the desire for high quality, meticulously crafted items continues to thrive, reminiscent of the work that medieval guilds once protected. Another significant legacy of the guilds is the concept of workers' rights and collective bargaining. The guilds were essentially the first union like structures where workers, artisans, and craftsmen came together to protect their mutual interests. They controlled wages, set prices for goods, and ensured that members were treated fairly by both their peers and the surrounding society. As labor unions emerged in the Industrial Revolution, the principles of collective action, fair compensation, and shared responsibility that the guilds embodied were carried forward. The guilds also established a sense of pride in one's craft. They helped create the idea that work should be a form of identity, a source of personal dignity. For guild members, the act of craftsmanship was more than just a job. It was a calling, a way of life. This pride in craftsmanship is still very much alive today in the form of skilled trades such as carpentry, tailoring, or metalworking, where individuals take great pride in their ability to create something of lasting value. But as the world moved further into the modern era, the guilds began to lose their relevance in an economy driven by industrialization, urbanization, and the rise of free market capitalism. The shift away from small scale, craft based economies to mass production led to the dismantling of the guilds. However, their dissolution did not erase the important roles they played in shaping economic practices. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new era, one that built upon the foundation the guilds had laid. Today, many aspects of modern business are rooted in principles that originated with the guilds, from the importance of professional accreditation to the regulations that govern industries. The guild's focus on quality, training, and collaboration remains a guiding force. The rise of the cooperative business model in the 19th and 20th centuries can also be traced back to the guild's emphasis on mutual benefit and shared resources. In a world of individual entrepreneurship, the guilds were one of the first to recognize the power of collective strength. As you reflect on the lasting influence of the medieval guilds, it's clear that their impact is far-reaching. While their direct power may have faded with the rise of industrial economies and modern business practices, the essence of their work lives on in every industry that values craftsmanship, quality, and workers' rights. The guilds were not just institutions of trade, they were also communities that emphasized solidarity, pride in one's work, and the value of knowledge shared across generations. Standing in the shadow of their legacy, you realize that the world of the medieval guilds was not just about the goods they produced or the trades they controlled. It was about the people who came together to build something greater than themselves. It was about creating a society where work was not just a means of survival, but a source of pride, connection, and shared purpose. The guilds may have been dismantled, but their influence persists in every artisan's workshop, in every cooperative, in every union that fights for workers' rights. The spirit of the guilds lives on. They remind us that even in a world dominated by large corporations and impersonal industries, the values of craftsmanship, solidarity, and respect for the work we do remain timeless. As the day draws to a close and the world outside becomes still, let your mind settle gently, like the fading light of a sunset. The stories you've just heard about the artisans, the builders, the healers, and those whose names have slipped through the cracks of history have come to rest in the quiet corners of your thoughts, just as they did in the quiet chambers of their own time. You can almost hear the soft hum of the apothecary's shop, the delicate tapping of a craftsman's hammer, or the faint rustling of herbs in the garden as the wind whispers through the trees. These echoes, once loud and bustling, have softened into a distant murmur now, like memories that drift on a slow, calm breeze. It's easy to forget that the simplest acts, like an apothecary tending to his garden or a builder placing the final stone, can shape the world around us. But as you reflect on their lives, let their quiet strength and dedication bring a sense of peace. Perhaps, in the stillness of this moment, you, too, can find a bit of that timeless resolve hidden in the smallest of actions, in the quiet rhythm of everyday life. Now, as the evening light dims and the world sleeps, let the weight of these stories settle softly, gently, like the quiet comfort of a warm blanket on a cool night. There is no rush, no need to hold on to them tightly. Just allow the images to fade, like the last flickers of candlelight. Let the quiet settle in, and know that the history you've encountered today will softly linger just as you drift into rest. Good night.